After years of service in the Navy SEALs, I thought I had seen it all. From the chaos of the battlefield to the quiet, solitary moments of reflection after a mission, I'd experienced it all. But nothing could have prepared me for the life I'd be living now, a quiet, peaceful suburban neighborhood with my wife, where the hardest decisions were about landscaping or what to watch on TV. When I left the military, my wife and I decided we wanted to settle down in a community that felt calm, stable, and removed from the world I had once known. We chose a beautiful home in a family-friendly neighborhood, complete with tree-lined streets, neatly manicured lawns, and friendly neighbors. It seemed like the perfect place to enjoy a peaceful retirement. Life here had been smooth. We spent our days working on the house, attending community barbecues, and watching our neighbors' kids grow up. I even started volunteering at the local Veterans Center, helping others who had gone through similar experiences. It was a new chapter for both of us, one where the only hustle and bustle we had to worry about was whether the trash was picked up on time or if the mail was delivered. It wasn't the life of constant motion that I'd been used to, but it was exactly what we needed. There was no more danger, no more constant threat. For the first time in years, I could finally breathe easy, and we were starting to feel like we could truly enjoy the quiet that came with civilian life. But, as it often happens, peace never lasts forever. And it wouldn't be long before I'd find myself caught in the middle of a confrontation that would challenge everything I had come to appreciate about freedom and community. It all began with an innocuous little letter in the mailbox, one that I would soon come to regret opening. It started with a simple letter, just another piece of mail among the bills and flyers for local events. My wife opened it and handed it to me, and I immediately noticed the official-looking logo at the top. It was from the Homeowners Association, HOA, a group I had no real interest in, nor had I ever interacted with. I read through the letter with a growing sense of confusion. It was a formal notice stating that we had violated one of their community guidelines. The letter mentioned an overgrown bush near our driveway and a slightly off-center fence. In short, it was a request to make sure the lawn was cut precisely to their standards and that our property adhered to every minute detail of their aesthetic rules. At first, I chuckled. The minor infractions they were complaining about didn't seem worth the hassle. We had been busy with renovations and hadn't paid much attention to the exact shape of the bush. But as I read further, it became clear that the HOA wasn't going to let this slide. Their letter was full of warnings, stating that if the issues weren't resolved within 15 days, we'd be subject to fines and further inspections. It didn't sit well with me. This wasn't the military. I didn't need anyone telling me how to run my household or manage my private property. I thought about calling them and explaining that we would take care of the issues, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't want to play their game. I glanced at my wife. "What do you think?" I asked. She sighed, clearly irritated by the intrusion. "It's ridiculous. We've lived here for years, and we've never had any issues. Why now?" I knew she was right. The neighborhood was calm, and we always took care of our property. The letter seemed like an unnecessary power grab from the HOA, as if they were starting to look for any excuse to assert control. I tossed the letter onto the table. "I'll take care of it, but I'm not going to let them push us around. This is our home, not some HOA project." I was determined not to let it escalate, but deep down, I had a sinking feeling that this wouldn't be the last time we heard from them. The HOA's intrusion was just the beginning of something that would soon become much bigger than a few overgrown bushes. The following week, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, it wasn't just a polite request, it was a formal warning. The letter stated that the bushes still hadn't been trimmed to the precise standards required by the community guidelines, and there was no record of the fence being fixed. The HOA was escalating the matter, and they had increased the fines significantly. The letter made it clear that if the violations weren't addressed within the next 5 days, we would be subject to legal action. I was livid. The more I read, the more it became clear that the HOA wasn't interested in simply maintaining community standards. They were trying to control every aspect of our lives. It wasn't just about an overgrown bush anymore. It was about their need to impose rules, no matter how trivial, and punish those who didn't comply. I decided it was time to take action. I called the HOA office, ready to get answers. When I spoke with the representative, I was met with a disinterested tone. "I see that you've received our letter, Mr. Your name. We've tried to resolve this amicably, but it seems you're still not in compliance with the guidelines." The voice on the other end was polite but cold. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. "I'm not disputing that we may have missed a couple of details, but these are minor issues. Why are you sending us threats of legal action? This is a complete overreach." "It's not an overreach," she replied. "The HOA exists to ensure the aesthetic and harmony of the community. We cannot allow exceptions." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. The power they had over us seemed absurd. I had to remind myself that these people weren't here to protect us. They were here to enforce their own perceived ideals of community living, even if it meant bullying residents into submission. After the call, I looked over at my wife, who had been listening from the kitchen. Her face was a mirror of my own thoughts, disbelief and anger. "What now?" she asked. "We need to handle this ourselves. I'm not going to let them walk all over us." The next day, a couple of HOA enforcers showed up on our doorstep, unannounced. They wore those signature bright yellow vests and carried clipboards. They didn't knock politely. They just walked right onto our property. One of them, a tall, middle-aged man with a stern expression, walked straight past me without acknowledging my presence. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "You need to leave." He didn't even look at me. "We're here to inspect the property, sir. We've been asked to verify that the violations have been addressed." I could feel my temper rising. The audacity of these people to just march onto our land without permission was astounding. I had had enough. I stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "No. You're not inspecting anything. This is my private property, and I've already told the HOA that I'll handle the issues. You need to leave now." The enforcer didn't flinch, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He looked over his shoulder at the other enforcer, a younger woman who was already snapping photos of our yard. She seemed uncomfortable, but didn't speak. "I'm afraid we'll have to report this," the man said stiffly. "But if you're not willing to comply, we have no choice but to escalate." I could feel my military training kicking in. "Not today." I stepped closer, my voice low and controlled but firm. "I told you to leave. Now. If you refuse, I'll be forced to get the authorities involved." The woman looked up from her camera, sensing the tension. She started to back away, and the man hesitated for a moment. I could tell he wasn't expecting someone like me to stand up to them. Finally, with a reluctant nod, he turned toward the exit. As they walked off the property, I stood there, my fists clenched. I had drawn a line in the sand, and for the first time since moving in, I felt the full weight of community control weighing on my shoulders. But I wasn't going to let the HOA break my spirit. The next steps were clear. I wasn't going to give in, and I wasn't going to let them bully me or my wife. This wasn't just about an overgrown bush anymore. This was about standing up to power that thought it could push us around. The battle had only just begun. The following week, things took a turn I never could have anticipated. I had assumed the worst was over after sending those enforcers packing, but I couldn't have been more wrong. The HOA, unwilling to back down, upped the ante. They sent a team of enforcers to our house once again, but this time, things escalated much more quickly. It was an unusually warm Tuesday afternoon when I arrived home from running errands. My wife, who had been doing some gardening in the front yard, called me in a shaky voice. "You need to come here right now. There are people on our property again." I dropped everything and rushed out the door, my heart already racing. When I reached the front yard, I saw 3 HOA enforcers, 2 men and a woman, standing just a few feet away from my wife. The woman was snapping photos of our yard, and the 2 men were circling the bushes near the driveway. I immediately recognized one of the men, the one who had previously been so insistent about inspecting the property. He was wearing the same bright yellow vest as before and carrying a clipboard, the same disrespectful air that seemed to follow him everywhere. I marched over, my blood already beginning to boil. "What are you doing here?" I demanded. "I've already told you that you're not welcome on my property." The woman didn't even acknowledge me, still too busy with her camera, but the two men turned toward me. One of them, the younger man, spoke up. "We're here to inspect the property again, mister. Your name?" "We've been sent by the HOA to ensure compliance with the community standards." I took a deep breath, trying to control my growing frustration. "You've already done that. You have no right to come back here. This is my private property, and I've asked you to leave. Now." That's when the other man, the one who had pushed my buttons the first time, took a step closer. His eyes narrowed, and there was a look of defiance on his face that set my nerves on edge. "You really think you can just ignore the HOA's rules, huh?" he sneered. "The rules are the rules. If you're not going to comply, we'll just keep sending people here until you do." I could feel the anger rising inside me, but before I could speak, the man reached out, trying to push past me. That's when things took a much darker turn. My wife, who had been quietly standing by, saw what was happening and stepped between us, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Don't touch him. You have no right to do this." The man, not used to being challenged by anyone on the property, shoved her aside in an attempt to get to me. She staggered back, losing her balance for a split second before catching herself. It was that shove, that one aggressive, unprovoked action, that pushed me past the point of no return. "Get your hands off my wife!" I shouted, stepping forward. But before I could say anything more, the younger man lunged at me, not as a joke, but with the intent to intimidate me. What happened next was a blur of instincts honed from years of training and discipline. I didn't hesitate. I was on the man in an instant, blocking his movement and throwing him off balance with a precise, controlled maneuver. He hit the ground with a thud, unable to regain his footing. His partner stood frozen, his hands up in confusion, clearly unsure of how to react. But I didn't even look at him. My focus was on the woman and the enforcer who had shoved my wife. He crossed the line, and now he was going to face the consequences. "Get off my property now." My voice was low, steady, but there was no mistaking the finality in it. The other enforcer stood there, his expression now one of shock. He didn't know what to say or do. The woman, still holding the camera, finally lowered it and backed off a few steps. They had pushed too far. I wasn't going to let them intimidate me or my wife any longer. The man on the ground tried to get back up, but I made sure he knew who was in charge. "You'll leave and never come back." The two men looked at each other, then at me. I could see the fear in their eyes now, and it was clear they knew they were outmatched. The woman quickly muttered, "We're done here." She motioned to the others, and they started backing away, not daring to engage further. I didn't move from the spot until they were completely off my property. They had crossed the line, and now I had made sure they understood that. As the enforcers retreated, I turned to my wife, who was still standing there, shaking slightly. I immediately walked over to her and wrapped my arms around her. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. She nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. This wasn't just about a boat anymore. The HOA's aggression had gone too far, and now they had targeted the people I cared about the most. I made a promise to myself in that moment: this wasn't over. I was going to protect my wife, my property, and my peace of mind. The HOA had no idea who they were dealing with, and they were about to learn the hard way. The moment the HOA enforcers retreated from my property, I felt a rush of adrenaline fade into a cold, simmering rage. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The fact that they had physically shoved my wife, the woman who had been nothing but peaceful and compliant, had crossed a line that I wasn't willing to overlook. I looked at my wife, still shaken but holding it together, and I took a deep breath. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but filled with concern. "I'm fine," she said, though I could see the fear in her eyes. Fear of what they had done, fear of what they could do next. But mostly, fear of what I would do next. I knew I couldn't let this go. The HOA had overstepped their bounds, and now they had targeted my family. No one pushed my wife or disrespected my property without facing consequences. I'm calling a lawyer, I told her, stepping back inside the house to grab my phone. This isn't just a community dispute anymore, it's assault. I couldn't believe it had come to this, but the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. The HOA wasn't just about petty violations anymore. They were a bullying organization, misusing their power, and they needed to be held accountable. It wasn't about a bush or a boat anymore, it was about standing up to unjust authority. I quickly dialed the number of a lawyer I'd worked with in the past, someone who specialized in property rights and civil liberties. After a few rings, he picked up. Hey, your name, how's everything? He greeted me casually, but I could tell something was off in my voice. We've got a problem. I went on to explain the incident, from the HOA's escalating demands to their physical confrontation with my wife. I made sure to emphasize the fact that they had crossed into illegal territory by physically assaulting her. You're right, this goes way beyond simple community regulations, the lawyer said after listening. We can take legal action for assault, trespassing, and harassment. I'll help you file a report with the police, and we'll make sure the HOA knows they're not getting away with this. I didn't need any more encouragement. I was ready to fight back. Not just for me, but for every resident who had been intimidated or bullied by the HOA's unlawful tactics. I was done being passive. Thank you, I said, feeling the weight of the situation settle in. Let's make sure they regret ever stepping foot on my land. I hung up the phone and turned to my wife. She was sitting at the kitchen table now, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, trying to calm her nerves. I could tell she was just as shaken as I was. We're going to handle this, I reassured her, sitting next to her. They won't get away with what they did. Her eyes looked up at me, still holding that mix of fear and uncertainty. But what if they come back? What if it gets worse? It won't, I said more firmly than I felt. We'll stand our ground. I've got my lawyer, and I'm not letting them walk all over us again. I won't let them hurt you. This time, we'll make sure they understand they can't just push us around. Asterisk asterisk. We didn't have to wait long to see what the HOA's next move would be. The enforcers' actions had sparked a chain reaction. The story of what had happened at our house began to spread like wildfire in the neighborhood. Neighbors, who had once been afraid of the HOA's control, started rallying behind us, speaking out about the abuses they'd suffered quietly for years. I realized it wasn't just about protecting our home. It was about standing up for everyone who had been silenced by the HOA's bullying tactics. That evening, I sat down and began drafting a formal statement to the HOA, telling them that their actions were unacceptable and that we would pursue every legal avenue possible. I made it clear that I was prepared to go public with everything: the assault, the harassment, and the unlawful demands. As I finished typing, my wife looked at me with a sigh of relief, the tension in her shoulders beginning to ease. I wasn't just doing this for me or for her. I was doing this for everyone who had been hurt by this organization. The battle had only just begun, but I was ready for whatever came next. This time, I wasn't just protecting my property. I was fighting for our freedom to live without fear or intimidation. And the HOA? They had just picked the wrong man to mess with. The days following the incident were a blur of legal consultations and planning. I worked with my lawyer to prepare our case, gathering everything I could: witness statements, photos of the trespassing enforcers, and the assault my wife had endured. We were methodical, every step calculated to ensure we had the strongest possible case. Meanwhile, the community began to rally around us. Neighbors who had previously been silent about their grievances with the HOA now stepped forward. They were sick of being bullied by an organization that had long overstepped its bounds. I knew the HOA was watching. They had to know that we were serious. Still, despite the mounting pressure and mounting evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't backing down yet. They had been trying to assert their authority for far too long, and now that their abuse was exposed, I expected them to double down, and sure enough, they did. One evening, my wife and I were sitting down to dinner when I saw the headlights of a car pulling into our driveway. It wasn't unusual for people to drive by. It was a relatively quiet street, but there was something about the car that made my instincts go on high alert. I looked out the window and saw a figure walking toward our front door. It was Gregory Hanley, the HOA president. I stood up from the table, my pulse quickening. He had come to our door before, but this time, it felt different. I opened the door, and Gregory immediately stepped forward, trying to get inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk, Mr. Your name." His tone was calm but with an edge that made my spine stiffen. "Not now, Gregory. You've done enough already," I said, stepping back to prevent him from entering. He paused, eyes narrowing. "I understand you're upset, but this has gone far enough. The HOA board can't just let you disrupt everything. You've made this personal, and now it's starting to affect the entire community." I crossed my arms, unimpressed. "No, Gregory. You've made this personal. Your enforcers came onto my property, physically assaulted my wife, and thought they could bully me into submission. I've already told you I'm not backing down. You're not welcome here." His face tightened, but he didn't move away. Instead, he lowered his voice, trying to intimidate me. "You need to understand something. This isn't just about your boat or your bushes anymore. You're making this about something much bigger, and you're dragging the entire community into your mess." I shook my head. "No, Gregory, it's not about my boat. It's about the bullying and the abuse of power. You pushed us to the edge, and now you'll deal with the consequences." There was a long pause as Gregory studied me, clearly calculating his next move. "You're making a mistake. If you don't back down, we'll escalate this. You'll regret it." I took a step forward, my jaw set. "Then bring it, Gregory. You've already made your move. But remember this, you underestimated me. I'm not afraid of your empty threats or your lawsuits. You don't control me." Gregory stared at me for a long moment before turning on his heel and walking back to his car without saying another word. I didn't let my guard down until he was gone, but I knew it wasn't over. The HOA had just given me their final warning, but this wasn't about backing down for me. I had seen enough abuses of power in my military career to recognize them when I saw them, and I wasn't about to let these people run roughshod over me and my family. The following day, I received a formal notice from the HOA. They had filed a lawsuit against me, claiming that I was in violation of community guidelines, citing everything from fence placement to their fabricated claims about the boat. It was the final step in their desperate attempt to reassert control. But this time, they had miscalculated. The gloves were off. It was no longer just about the boat. It was about standing up to a group that thought it could trample on the rights of its residents, and no one was going to stop me. The battle lines had been drawn, and I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't backing down. The lawsuit filed by the HOA felt like the moment things had truly escalated. The legal papers arrived one morning, and as I opened them, I could see they were not just about the trivial complaints anymore. The HOA had gone all in. They wanted to crush me, not just for the boat or the bushes, but for challenging their authority. They were hoping I'd back down, that I'd compromise and quietly pay the fines, but they were wrong. I immediately called my lawyer, the one who had been working with me on the HOA's previous overreach. He was calm but firm when I explained what had happened. "This is exactly what we expected, Mr. Your name," he said. "They're trying to intimidate you with the legal system. But you've got a strong case. We'll fight this. We'll make them regret ever stepping foot on your property." I felt a surge of confidence hearing those words. I'd been in tough situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about property rights anymore. This was about standing up to tyranny. The HOA had picked the wrong person to mess with, and I wasn't going to let them push me around anymore. The next few weeks were a blur of court dates, depositions, and more threats from the HOA. Their lawyers, who had clearly been prepared for a long, drawn-out battle, tried to intimidate me at every turn. They made repeated attempts to get me to settle, offering concessions here and there, but I wasn't having any of it. I knew they were just trying to break me down, hoping that I'd give in and make the situation go away. But I didn't back down. My lawyer and I were relentless, hitting the HOA with everything we had. We had witness statements, photos, videos of the enforcers on my property, and even a solid case for harassment and assault for the incident with my wife. The pressure was starting to build on the HOA, and they didn't like it. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call. It was from Ashley, the local reporter who had covered the story when the HOA first tried to bully me. She had been keeping tabs on the case and had noticed something interesting. "Mr. Your name, I've got some intel that could really turn the tide in your favor," she said. "There are rumors that the HOA has been involved in some shady dealings with local contractors and has been pressuring the board members for years to push their agenda. I've got sources who say the HOA's been using tactics like yours, bullying people to comply with their demands. You've got to let me expose this. It could bury them in the media." I didn't hesitate. "Do it. Let the world see what they've been doing." Ashley ran with the story. It quickly became a local sensation, with more residents speaking out about their experiences with the HOA's unfair practices. The news coverage started gaining momentum, and the public outcry grew louder. It was no longer just a dispute between me and the HOA, it was a community-wide issue. The pressure on the HOA was immense. Their reputation was starting to unravel in front of the public eye. People began to question everything they'd done, from the unjust fines to the bullying tactics they had used to control the neighborhood. The more the story spread, the more residents began to see the HOA for what it truly was, an organization built on abuse of power. Finally, after weeks of legal pressure and public humiliation, the HOA offered a settlement. They proposed that all legal action be dropped, that they would stop pursuing the fines and violations, and that they would issue a formal apology to both me and my wife. It wasn't the complete victory I had imagined, but it was enough to make my point. They had failed to intimidate us, and they were finally acknowledging that. The settlement also included a clause that required the HOA to revise its policies. They would no longer be allowed to enforce rules without community input, and any future disputes would be handled by neutral parties, not a group of self-appointed enforcers. With the legal battle behind us, I was finally able to breathe again. But more importantly, we had won. The HOA had learned a painful lesson. They couldn't bully us, and they couldn't dictate how we lived on our own property. And as for the community? They were stronger for it. The victory wasn't just mine, it was the neighborhood's. We had stood together against an organization that thought it could push us around. The battle had been tough, but in the end, it had changed our community for the better. I walked back to the lake, looked out over the water, and realized that this wasn't just about a boat anymore. It was about freedom, family, and fighting for what's right. And with that, the neighborhood was finally at peace. After the dust settled and the settlement was finalized, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted dramatically. The HOA's defeat wasn't just a win for me and my wife, it was a win for the entire community. People began to speak out, sharing their stories of how the HOA had overstepped in various ways. Many neighbors who had been living in fear of the HOA's heavy hand now felt emboldened. As for my wife and I, we took a step back, finally able to enjoy the peace we had fought for. But it was clear that the impact of our battle had rippled through the neighborhood. People who had once kept their heads down now walked with their shoulders back, no longer afraid of speaking up when something wasn't right. It wasn't just about the settlement or the lawsuit. It was about the change in how people viewed their rights. We were no longer just residents in the HOA's system, we were individuals with the power to defend our property, our freedom, and our peace of mind. In the weeks that followed, I was approached by several neighbors, each with their own story. Martha, who lived down the street, came by with a small thank you card. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, a little embarrassed but clearly sincere. "We've been here for 12 years, and we've always been afraid to speak up. But after what you did, I feel like maybe we don't have to just take whatever the HOA throws at us." It was moments like this that made everything worthwhile. As much as I had wanted to protect my own home, I now realized that this had become about something far bigger. Empowerment. Justice. Community. A few days later, I received an email from Ashley, the reporter who had helped expose the HOA's shady dealings. She shared a copy of the follow-up story she had written, which was picked up by several local news outlets. The title read, "Neighborhood Takes Back Control After HOA's Abuse of Power Exposed." The article went on to detail how our victory had sparked widespread change in the community. The HOA had been forced to reevaluate its authority, and in the wake of the public outcry, some board members had stepped down. There were even talks of creating a more community-driven approach to governing the neighborhood, with better representation for the residents. Despite the relief we felt, I knew we had set a precedent. No longer would the HOA be able to throw its weight around unchecked. Residents began taking more interest in community meetings, and soon, there was a push to change the entire structure of the HOA. They would no longer be a faceless bureaucracy enforcing obscure rules. Instead, they would be accountable to the people who lived in the neighborhood. At a meeting a few months later, the HOA board president was replaced by a new leader who had a very different approach. They promised to be more transparent, with open dialogues and community involvement in every decision. The power structure had fundamentally shifted, and the residents now felt empowered. As I stood by the lake, watching the sunset with my wife, I realized that this fight hadn't just been about keeping a boat or maintaining a perfect lawn, it had been about fighting for the right to live on our own terms. We had stood up to an organization that thought it could control us and had come out on the other side stronger, with a neighborhood that was united and more resilient than ever. The victory had been hard-won, but it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a win for every homeowner who had felt trapped or silenced by the HOA's overreach. No one had the right to tell us how to live on our own land. And now, the community knew that it had the power to fight back when something wasn't right. It was a new beginning for us, and for everyone in the neighborhood. The HOA may have tried to take control, but in the end, the power had shifted to the people, and that made all the difference. Months passed, and the neighborhood was finally starting to feel like it had a new lease on life. The HOA's influence was practically non-existent, and the changes they had been forced to make were already having a positive impact. People were more willing to take ownership of their homes and the decisions that impacted their community, without fearing arbitrary fines or unwarranted threats from the HOA. But despite all the progress, I knew the HOA wasn't done. They had lost control for now, but I had a sinking feeling that they might make one more desperate attempt to reassert their authority. Then, one morning, I was proven right. I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Gregory Hanley, the same HOA president who had come to my door months ago. His voice, once so confident, was now filled with a tone I hadn't heard before: resignation. "Mr. Your name," he began. "I need to talk to you. It's about the future of the HOA." I sat up straight, wary of what he might say next. "What's this about, Gregory? I thought the HOA had learned its lesson." He paused. "We have, but it's become clear that the old way of doing things isn't working anymore. The board members, myself included, are stepping down. We can't keep going like this." The weight of his words hit me hard. I didn't know whether to be relieved or to remain cautious. The HOA was clearly on the verge of collapse. "What does this mean?" I asked, trying to make sense of the situation. Gregory continued. "We're going to dissolve the current board and replace it with new members, residents from the community who will actually represent the people's interests. We're restructuring the entire HOA, starting from scratch. I know you've been a big part of the push for change, and we want you to be part of the process." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The HOA, which had once tried to control every aspect of our lives, was now completely restructuring itself. "Are you telling me you're giving up your position?" I asked, skeptical. "What's the catch?" Gregory hesitated, his voice softer now. "I've been in this role for years, Mr. Your Name, and it's become clear that this isn't the kind of leadership the community wants. We thought we could force compliance, but we didn't realize that the real power lies with the people. We've been trying to hold on to something that's no longer ours. It's time for the HOA to become what it was always supposed to be, a service to the community, not a tool of control." I was still trying to process everything. The power shift that had happened in the neighborhood had completely turned the tables on the HOA. It was remarkable to think that my fight had led to such a massive transformation, not just in my life, but for the entire community. So, what now? I asked, still unsure about where this would lead. Gregory took a deep breath. We're dissolving the old board, and we've set up a community meeting where residents can come together to rebuild the HOA from the ground up. You're invited to attend, and we'd like to know if you'd be interested in leading the transition. I'm stepping down, and we're looking for someone who understands what the community needs. We want to make sure this never happens again. The community meeting was held a few weeks later, and it was clear from the start that this was not going to be a traditional HOA meeting. The residents were excited, engaged, and eager to take control. There was no longer any fear of the HOA's heavy hand. People spoke up freely, shared their experiences, and outlined a vision for a fairer, more transparent HOA. When it came time to nominate new board members, I was surprised to find that many people wanted me to be part of the transition process. They saw the way I had fought for their rights, and they trusted me to ensure that the HOA would never again be a tool of oppression. I didn't expect to become the face of this new chapter, but after everything that had happened, it felt like the right thing to do. The HOA, which had once been an enemy, could now be part of something good, if we did it right. In the months that followed, the new HOA board worked tirelessly to create a system that truly served the community. We implemented regular meetings, encouraged community input, and ensured that decisions were made transparently. The power dynamics had completely shifted, and the residents were now in control of the organization that was supposed to serve them. The HOA's transformation was nothing short of a miracle for our neighborhood. The days of being bullied by self-serving enforcers were gone, replaced by a system where respect and accountability were the foundation. As I stood by the lake, watching the sun set over the water, I knew that our community was stronger than ever. What had started as a small act of defiance had turned into a powerful movement, a movement that not only gave us back control of our lives but also brought us closer together as neighbors, united by the belief that we could live freely without fear of being controlled by an unjust organization. In the end, I had learned that even when the fight seems impossible, standing up for what's right can lead to the most incredible changes, for yourself and for the people around you. And as for the HOA? They had learned that you can't just bully people into submission. Because when you challenge a community's rights, you're up against more than just an individual. You're up against a force that's far more powerful, the collective will of the people. The transformation of the HOA had a profound effect on the neighborhood. Over the next several months, the changes we had implemented were beginning to take root. The new board, made up of residents who truly understood the needs of the community, worked tirelessly to create a more inclusive and transparent system. No longer were the residents just subject to arbitrary rules from an unseen group of enforcers. Now, they were part of the decision-making process. One of the first things we did was introduce a monthly community forum, where residents could openly discuss concerns, suggest improvements, and vote on neighborhood policies. It was a revolutionary idea, considering how little community input had been allowed under the old HOA leadership. We also created a neighborhood newsletter to keep everyone informed about changes, upcoming events, and general updates about the HOA's activities. The HOA was no longer a shadowy organization. It was now an open and active part of our lives. But what really mattered was how much better the community felt. The fear and resentment that had previously existed were replaced by a new sense of unity. People started helping one another more, organizing block parties, holiday events, and community service projects. The HOA, which had once been a divisive force, now became a vehicle for positive change. It became a reflection of our shared values and collective goals. One of the most rewarding parts of this new chapter was seeing the difference in my own neighborhood. The tension that had once existed between residents and the HOA was gone. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves began to engage in the process. People were no longer afraid to speak up or challenge decisions they didn't agree with. It was as if a new energy had been injected into the community, a feeling of ownership and responsibility that had been sorely lacking before. My wife and I began to feel the weight of this change, too. We'd gone through so much, from the initial confrontation with the HOA to the legal battle that had followed. But now, we were able to breathe freely. We had regained not just our property rights, but our sense of security and community. As the months passed, I received several calls and letters from neighbors expressing their gratitude. They thanked me for standing up to the HOA, for fighting not just for my own rights, but for theirs as well. One neighbor, Tom, who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, stopped by one evening to shake my hand. "You've changed this place your name," he said. "We've lived under the thumb of that HOA for far too long, and I never thought we'd get our voices back. What you did! You gave us all a chance to be heard." His words were humbling, and I realized that the victory we'd won had not just been a personal one, it had been a community victory. We had fought for something much bigger than ourselves. We had fought for the right to live freely and to be respected as individuals, not just property owners who could be pushed around by a faceless organization. One evening, as I sat by the lake, watching the sunset reflect off the water, I reflected on how far we'd come. It had all started with an injustice, a petty rule about a boat. But from that small seed, we had grown a movement that had redefined what it meant to be a community. I looked over at my wife, who was sitting beside me, and smiled. She had been through so much with me, supporting me every step of the way. I knew she had been worried, unsure of how far this fight would go, but now we were living in a neighborhood that was, for the first time, truly ours. We had won, not just in the legal sense, but in the way the community had come together. "We did it, didn't we?" she said, her voice soft but full of satisfaction. I nodded, squeezing her hand. "We did. And we made sure that no one else would have to go through what we did." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew that the fight had been worth it. The victory wasn't just about beating the HOA, it was about something deeper, about freedom, unity, and standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. In the end, the HOA didn't just lose a fight, they lost their grip on the neighborhood. And the people, our community, came out stronger than ever. It was a victory not just for me, but for everyone who believed in the power of people working together to reclaim their rights, their land, and their peace. Despite the progress and the positive changes in the neighborhood, I knew the HOA wasn't about to let go of the power they had lost so easily. We had dismantled their authority, but I could sense that their pride and desperation hadn't disappeared entirely. It seemed that they couldn't bear to accept that they had been outclassed, that their tyranny had been challenged and exposed. One day, a few months after the restructuring, I received a letter from the HOA. This time, it wasn't an official notice of violations or a demand for fines. Instead, it was a letter from the new HOA president, who, despite all the changes we had implemented, still felt the need to negotiate. The letter requested that I attend a private meeting to discuss a possible compromise, as if anything could be salvaged from the wreckage they had created. I wasn't surprised. They had tried to maintain their grip on power, even after being dethroned. But what shocked me was the audacity of their tone. The letter was filled with vague threats and backhanded comments, implying that if I didn't attend the meeting, things could get messy for me and the community. I took a deep breath and read it over again. The old HOA leadership hadn't given up on trying to control the neighborhood, but this time, they were coming at us from a place of weakness. I felt a sense of finality settle in. Their last-ditch attempt to reclaim authority wouldn't work. I had no intention of entertaining their manipulation any longer. I called my lawyer, explaining the situation. He wasn't surprised either. He had predicted this move from the beginning. "They'll keep trying, but it's not going to work. The new board is legitimate now, and this kind of move is only going to make them look more desperate." We agreed that the best course of action was to ignore the meeting and instead go public with the letter. I knew it would stir up more attention, and it would expose just how out of touch the HOA was with the reality of what had happened. The community had already rejected them, but this would be the final nail in their coffin. I made sure to get local media involved again. Ashley, the reporter who had helped me during the earlier stages of the battle, was eager to pick up the story. She arranged for a press release to go out, sharing the HOA's attempt to regain power and control and highlighting their continued arrogance in the face of overwhelming community opposition. We made it clear that we were not backing down, and we encouraged the residents to speak up once more. The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. The story went viral, and the HOA's reputation plummeted even further. Neighbors who had been hesitant before now felt emboldened to come forward with their own stories of how they had been mistreated by the HOA in the past. It wasn't just about my fight anymore, it was about all of us.